The GPS rerouted me through the Walmart parking lot on Route 9 because there was a fender bender on the main road, and I almost didn't look twice at the old Honda Civic, parked alone in the far corner, engine off, windows fogged solid from the inside. But something made me slow down. There was a child's handprint pressed against the rear passenger window, small fingers, spread wide like a little star, and beside it a larger palm print, as if someone had been leaning their whole hand flat against the glass just to feel the cold. I pulled over. I don't know what I was expecting to find. I had been driving home from my book club 40 minutes from my house at 9:30 on a Thursday night in February. I was tired and my hip was aching, and the last thing I wanted was to stop in a dark parking lot. But something in me was already out of the car before I had finished thinking about it. I tapped the window. Nothing. I tapped again. The back seat shifted. A head came up slowly, hair tangled, eyes half open and frightened, and then those eyes went wide and I watched the colour drain from my granddaughter's face like water out of a cracked glass. She stared at me through that fogged window for a long moment. She did not reach for the door handle. She pressed herself backward, pulling her sleeping daughter tighter against her, and her mouth formed one word that I could not hear through the glass, but that I could read perfectly. She said, "No." I said her name. I said it again, louder. I held my hand flat against the glass where her handprint had been. Then I watched her cry. She did not unlock the door for almost a full minute. When she finally did, and when I finally pulled that door open and climbed halfway inside that freezing, cramped, terrible little car, I understood immediately. There were grocery bags stuffed under the passenger seat, a diaper bag wedged between the front seats, her daughter's winter coat folded neatly into a makeshift pillow, a battery-powered lantern, a half-empty jug of water. They had been living in this car. I did not ask how long, not yet, I just said, "You're coming home with me." Adele shook her head. She said I didn't understand. She said she had tried reaching me 2 years ago. She had called and even written letters, and everything came back. She said her husband Dixon had shown her my obituary, had driven her to the funeral home in Claremont himself, and pointed to my name in the records, had held her while she cried. She believed I was dead. I sat in that cold back seat with her and her daughter sleeping between us, and I said the words slowly so she could hear them clearly. I said, "I am right here, I have been here the entire time." She came apart then in a way I had not seen since she was 11 old, and her mother, my daughter Audra, passed away. She cried with her whole body, and little Junie, barely awake, reached up and patted her mother's face with one starfish hand, and then turned and looked at me with Audra's exact brown eyes. That was the moment I understood that whatever had been done to this family had been done deliberately, and that someone was going to have to answer for every single day of it. Franklin had been our family attorney for 22 years. He had handled Audra's estate after she died, had helped me set up the trust I intended to leave for Adele and, someday, for Adele's children. He was not a dramatic man. He spoke in careful sentences and wore the same grey suits he had probably worn since 1987. When I called him the morning after I brought Adele home, his voice did not change much. He just said, "Tell me everything and don't leave anything out." I told him about the parking lot. I told him about the fake obituary. I told him that my granddaughter had spent 3 months in the car with an 18-month-old baby because she had nowhere to go and no one to call, because she had been made to believe the one person who would have come for her without question was already in the ground. Franklin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When did she marry Dixon Hale?" 3 years ago. I had been at the wedding, in a rented garden venue outside of Nashville, watching Adele walk down a white cloth aisle toward a man who smiled with every muscle in his face except his eyes. I had not said anything. Adele had loved him, or had believed she did, and what kind of grandmother ruins a wedding day over a feeling she cannot name? I named it now. Franklin told me not to touch anything, not to make any calls, not to say a word to Dixon or his family. He said he would begin pulling records within the hour. I went upstairs. Adele was asleep in her old bedroom, the one with the yellow curtains she had picked out herself at 14. Junie was in the travel crib we had borrowed from my neighbour Berta's storage room, one arm flung over her head, breathing slow, and even like she had never slept so safely in her life. I stood in the doorway between those 2 rooms for a long time. The first thing Franklin found was the mail. Adele had written to me 4 times in the 8 months before Dixon showed her the obituary. She had called 17 times. 3 of the letters had been returned to her as undeliverable. But the postal records did not support that. The letters had been received at my address and signed for. The signature on 2 of them was not mine. I had a live-in housekeeper at the time, a woman named Berta who had been with me for 6 years. Berta told Franklin when he asked her directly that she had sometimes collected the mail when I was traveling. She handed him the dates. She had no memory of anything from Adele, but she also could not explain the signatures. The 3rd letter Franklin found had been opened and resealed. There were slight tears along the envelope flap consistent with being steamed. Franklin brought me a copy of Adele's 3rd letter. She had written it the month before Dixon showed her the obituary. She had told me in that letter that something was wrong with the finances, that money was going somewhere she could not track. That Dixon had started keeping the credit card statements locked in his desk drawer, that she was afraid to ask questions because the last time she had asked about the savings account he had not spoken to her for 4 days. She had asked me in that letter if she could come stay with me for a while, just for a little while, until she figured out what to do. She never heard back. Because that letter never reached me. Franklin explained it carefully, the way he explains things when he already knows the shape of what he's found and is giving you time to catch up. Dixon had not acted alone. His mother, Darla Hale, lived 40 minutes from me. She had, at some point in the preceding 2 years, cultivated a relationship with someone at the postal sorting facility where my route ran. Franklin did not have proof of that yet. What he had was the returned mail records, the tampered envelope, a pattern of interception that was too consistent to be coincidence, and a copy of the obituary Dixon had shown Adele. That obituary was the clearest thing. It had my name, my birth year, a fabricated death date in March 2 years ago. It was formatted to look like a real newspaper listing. The funeral home it cited was real, which was what had made Adele believe it. But the home's record showed no such listing. Someone had designed that document, printed it, and handed it to my granddaughter while she was already confused and frightened and grieving. Franklin set the printed copy of it on the table in front of me, and I read my own name on it, and I felt something cold move through me that I still do not have a word for. The second thing Franklin found was the trust. Specifically, he found an amendment to the trust that I had not signed. My husband had set up the original family trust before he died 10 years ago. The trust named Adele as a primary beneficiary. When Audra passed, I had worked with Franklin to ensure Adele's portion was protected and would transfer directly to her when she turned 30 or sooner under certain conditions. The amendment Dixon had somehow filed with a notary in Claremont changed the beneficiary structure. It named Dixon as a co-trustee with authority to manage distributions on Adele's behalf until she turned 40. The justification given was, and I am quoting directly, documented concerns regarding the emotional vulnerability of the beneficiary following the death of her grandmother. He had filed paperwork citing my death before he had even shown Adele the fake obituary. The notary whose stamp appeared on that amendment had retired to Florida 8 months ago. Franklin reached him by phone. The man became very quiet when Franklin read him the document number. He said he needed to call his own attorney before saying anything further. Franklin thanked him and hung up and called me. He said, "This goes further than I thought." I said, "How much further?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Dixon had married Adele 18 months after Audra died, at the precise point when Adele would have been most isolated and most in need of support, and that the timing of everything since then suggested a man who had done his research first. I asked what he meant. Franklin said he knew about the trust before he ever asked her to dinner. The room got very still around those words. I was the one who called Dixon. Franklin advised against it. He wanted to bring Dixon in through official channels, let the financial investigators handle the approach. But I had been thinking about that parking lot for 10 days by then, about those grocery bags under the seat and that folded coat used as a pillow, about Junie's palm print on the foggy window, and I needed Dixon to come to my house, not to a lawyer's office, because I needed to see his face. I told him I had found Adele. I told him we needed to discuss the divorce arrangements and the trust. I used a careful, measured voice, the same one I used for 30 years running the administration office at Hargrove College, the voice that gets people to do what you need without knowing they've been asked. Dixon said he was glad Adele was safe. He said it with the particular smoothness of a man who has practiced sincerity until it sounds almost real. He came on a Tuesday morning. He wore a blue blazer and drove a car. I did not recognize and walked into my front hallway with the easy confidence of a man who believed he still controlled the situation. He did not control the situation. Franklin was already seated in the front room. There was a woman from the Financial Crimes Division of the State Attorney's Office sitting next to Franklin, a quiet woman named Agent Prescott, who had driven up from Nashville the evening before. Adele was upstairs with Berta and Junie. I had asked her to stay up there until I came for her, and she had agreed, and I had seen in her face that she trusted me, and that trust felt like something I intended to spend the rest of my life being worthy of. Dixon walked into the front room and saw Franklin. His pace slowed just slightly. Then he saw Agent Prescott, and then he stopped. He looked at me. He said, "What is this?" I said, "Sit down, Dixon." He sat. He arranged his face into concern and kept it there, that practiced performance, while Franklin laid the documents out one by one. The intercepted letters, the mail signatures, the fake obituary, the fraudulent trust amendment, the notary contact, the timeline of the joint accounts being drained, which had happened in a single overnight transfer 4 days before Dixon moved out. Dixon said very little during this part. He looked at the documents and then looked away from them and said things like, "That's not how I remember it," and "I think you're misreading the sequence here." Agent Prescott asked him to explain the overnight transfer. He said he had needed to protect the assets during the divorce. Franklin asked him to explain the trust amendment. Dixon said Adele had been struggling emotionally after my death. He paused on that word, glanced at me, corrected himself. After the report of my death, and he had only been trying to ensure her finances were managed responsibly during a difficult time. I asked him who gave him the right to decide what was responsible for my granddaughter. He looked at me. Something behind his practiced expression shifted just slightly. He said, "She wasn't handling things well. She needed guidance." Franklin placed the timeline chart on the table. It showed the trust research, the courtship, the marriage, the gradual isolation, the mail interception, the fake obituary, the trust amendment, the account drain, all lined up in sequence with dates and amounts. Dixon looked at that chart for a long moment. And then he said the truest thing he had said in the entire hour. He said, "She would have wasted it anyway. The money, the house, all of it. She didn't have the first idea how to manage what that trust was worth. I was protecting a future she didn't even know how to want." The room went very quiet. I had been waiting for that sentence. Not because I knew it was coming, but because I had learned, in 67 years, that men who do what Dixon had done always believe it in the end. They always believe that their cruelty was management, and their theft was rescue, and their control was love. I said very quietly, "She was your wife, not your project." Agent Prescott put her pen down and looked at Dixon and told him that based on the documentation, her office would be initiating a full investigation into fraudulent document filing, financial interference, mail tampering as a federal matter, and coercive control under the state's revised domestic statute. She told him he was not under arrest at this moment, but that he should not travel, and that if he had an attorney, now was the time to call them. Dixon stood up. He looked at me with something I had not expected to see on his face, not anger, not defiance. Fear. He said, "I gave her 3 years of my life." I said, "You took 3 years of hers." He left the way men like that always leave when the room is no longer theirs, quickly, without looking back, as if the speed of his exit could undo the fact of the documents still sitting on the table. I went upstairs. Adele was sitting on the edge of the bed in the yellow curtain room, holding Junie in her lap, reading her a board book about farm animals. Junie was pointing at the pictures and making sounds that were not quite words yet, but were clearly opinions. I sat down beside them. I told Adele what had happened. I told her everything, in the same order Franklin had laid it out to me, because she deserved to hear it clearly and completely and not softened. She was 28 years old and she was not fragile. She had survived 3 months in a parking lot with a baby, and I was not going to protect her from the truth of what had been done to her. She listened without interrupting. Her face did several things in the course of that conversation, none of which I will try to describe, because some expressions do not belong to anyone but the person wearing them. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He drove me to the funeral home." "I know." He held my hand while I cried. "I know." She looked down at Junie, who had lost interest in the farm book and was now trying to eat the corner of it. "I kept thinking something was wrong with me," she said. "Every time I couldn't reach you, I thought maybe I'd said something, done something. He kept telling me you had always found me difficult. That one landed hard. I said, "You are the best thing in my life, you and your daughter. I want you to hear that from me clearly so that it is in your head, and you can come back to it whenever you need it." Junie looked up at me then with those brown Audra eyes and held out the corner of the board book, offering it to me generously. I took it. I pretended to examine it with great seriousness. Junie patted my knee in approval. Adele laughed. It was a surprised laugh, cracked around the edges, the kind that comes out when something catches you off guard in the middle of grief. It was the best sound I had heard in years. The months that followed were not simple, but they were honest, and honest is something I had stopped taking for granted. The investigation moved through the proper channels, which is to say it moved slowly, and with great paperwork. Dixon's attorney tried twice to reframe the trust amendment as a legitimate protective measure. Both times, Franklin dismantled the argument with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. The fraudulent notarization was confirmed. The mail tampering fell under federal jurisdiction and moved faster than the financial case. Darla Hale, Dixon's mother, was interviewed 3 times and eventually provided a statement that implicated her own son in exchange for reduced exposure on her own charges. The notary in Florida, once his attorney had reviewed the situation, provided a full account of how the document had been brought to him and what he had been told to stamp. Dixon's professional license in financial consulting was suspended pending the outcome. The accounts were frozen. The fraudulent trust amendment was voided. The trust reverted to its original terms, with Adele as sole beneficiary and Franklin as the neutral trustee until Adele decided otherwise. The morning Franklin called to confirm the trust was restored, I was in the kitchen making coffee while Adele sat at the table helping Junie figure out a shape-sorting toy. Junie was deeply committed to forcing the square block through the circular hole. Adele was watching her with the particular patient amusement of a mother who has learned that some lessons cannot be rushed. I hung up the phone and told Adele. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "My mother's name is in that trust." I said yes. Audra had been named in the original documents, and even after her death, your father and I had left a small commemorative clause, her name listed among the people whose love had built what the trust was meant to protect. Adele pressed her lips together. She looked at her daughter. Then she said softly, "She never got to meet Junie." I sat down at the table across from her. I said, "She would have been beside herself." Adele smiled, a real one, not the careful kind she had been using for the first few weeks, the smile that says I am fine rather than I actually feel something. This was the other kind, the kind that reaches your eyes. Junie successfully forced the square block through the wrong hole by sheer determination and looked up at both of us with an expression of complete triumph. Spring came the way spring always does in Tennessee, suddenly and all at once, as if someone had opened a window in the sky. The yard behind the house filled up with things again. Adele planted tomatoes in the beds along the south fence, the same beds her mother had planted every April when Adele was small. Berta found Audra's old garden gloves in the shed and set them on the porch railing without saying anything about it. Adele found them there one morning and put them on without saying anything either. Junie discovered the back steps. This was a 2-week obsession. Up and down, holding the railing with tremendous concentration, looking up every few steps to make sure someone was watching. Someone was always watching. One afternoon in late April, Adele and I sat on the back porch in the warm late light while Junie toddled back and forth across the grass chasing a soap bubble that Berta had blown from the kitchen doorway. The sky was that particular shade of gold that doesn't last long and doesn't need to. Adele said, "I spent so long trying to figure out what I had done wrong." I waited. She said, "I kept going back over every conversation, every decision, thinking if I had just been different somehow, smarter, less trusting, more careful." I said, "You didn't do anything wrong." She looked at me. "I know that now," she said. "But I want to tell Junie someday, not to scare her. But so she understands that sometimes people who are supposed to protect you are the exact people you need protection from, and that knowing the difference is something you learn, not something you're born knowing." Junie caught the bubble. This was impossible, but she did it, and the bubble popped on her fingers, and she stood for a moment in total astonishment looking at her own hands, then looked back at us. We both applauded. Junie bowed. She had recently discovered bowing. Adele laughed again, that real laugh, and I thought about Audra standing in this exact yard, April light on her face, laughing at something I had said. I thought about how grief does not go away but how it changes shape over time, how it makes room, how love is stubborn that way, how it keeps finding ways to be present even after the person it belonged to is gone. I reached over and put my hand over Adele's hand on the armrest. She turned her palm up and held on. There is a photograph on the windowsill in my kitchen now. It was taken sometime in early June, candid. Berta took it on her phone without either of us knowing. In it, Adele is sitting at the kitchen table with Junie on her lap. Junie has her hands in a bowl of blueberries and is eating them with great focus. Adele is watching her and smiling, the kind of smile you cannot manufacture, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and private and earned. The window light is hitting them at the right angle. Audra is not in that picture, but she is somehow in it anyway. The set of Adele's shoulders, the way she tilts her head, the shape of her patience. Beneath that photograph, Berta put a small framed card, the kind you can get at any craft store. She printed a sentence on it in her careful handwriting. It says, "What was hidden will come into the light. What was taken will be returned." I did not ask her to put it there, she just knew. That is the part I want to say last, the thing I keep coming back to. Not the parking lot. Though I will think about that parking lot for the rest of my life. Not the fraudulent papers, or the frozen accounts, or the man in the blue blazer who believed that controlling someone was the same thing as caring for them. What I keep coming back to is the GPS rerouting me through that Walmart lot on Route 9 on a cold February night when my hip was aching and I only wanted to get home. Some people call that coincidence. I am 67 years old and I have buried a husband and a daughter, and I do not call it that anymore. I call it the thing that kept me moving when I almost didn't, the small quiet pressure that said, "Slow down, look again, this moment is asking something of you." If this story found you tonight, maybe that is the thing I want to leave with you. There is always someone who will slow down, someone who will look again, someone who will say, "You're coming home with me," and mean it without reservation. Be that person when it is asked of you, and when you are the one in the parking lot, when you are the one fogged in and frozen and too afraid to reach for the door, hold on just a little longer. The right car is still making its way to you.